They say the Mafia is built on honor. But there was no honor to be found at that table. Her mother-in-law mocked her as a hollow vessel. Her husband called her his greatest mistake. They even sat back and watched as a rival boss poured wine over her head, just to see if she would break. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. While they were busy enjoying her humiliation, she was busy signing the digital warrants that would leave their empire in ashes. They thought they were watching a victim drown in wine. They didn't realize they were watching a queen prepare for war. And the man waiting to help her build a new kingdom? He was already at the door. Welcome to my channel. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more Mafia boss stories. The heavy scent of expensive cologne and old money hung thick in the air of the mahogany-paneled office, but Elena barely noticed it. Her eyes were fixed on the glowing spreadsheet of the DeLuca family's offshore accounts. To the outside world, she was Elena DeLuca, the trophy wife with the quiet smile and the impeccable pink dresses. To the family's legal team and the federal investigators who hovered like vultures, she was a non-entity, a ghost in silk. They didn't know that she was the only reason the DeLuca empire hadn't collapsed under the weight of its own greed years ago. She moved $2 million from a shell company in Panama to a holding firm in the Caymans with 3 rhythmic clicks of her mouse. It was a delicate dance of numbers, a digital camouflage that protected her husband, Giovanni, from the prison cell that had his name written on it. Behind her, the door swung open without a knock. She didn't have to turn around to know it was him. The arrogant, heavy stride belonged to only one man. Giovanni walked to the bar, pouring himself a glass of scotch that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He didn't ask her how the audit was going or if she had managed to bury the latest police report. He simply stood there, staring at his own reflection in the window overlooking the city. To him, Elena was like the high-end air conditioning in the room, essential for his comfort, but utterly invisible unless it stopped working. The merger with the Moretti family is moving forward, Giovanni said, his voice flat and commanding. I need the contract scrubbed of any traces of the warehouse fire by tomorrow morning. Elena's fingers paused over the keys. That's a 48-hour job, Giovanni. The digital trail is messy. If I rush the scrubbing, the forensic accountants will see the seam. He finally turned, but he didn't look at her face. He looked at her as one might look at a malfunctioning toaster. Then don't rush it. Just do it. I have a reputation to maintain, Elena. I can't be bothered with the messy details. That's why I kept you around, isn't it? The word kept stung worse than a physical blow. She wasn't his partner, she was a utility. She was the brain that kept the heart of the Mafia beating, yet he spoke to her with less respect than he gave his drivers. He walked over, leaning down to grab his cigarettes from the desk. For a moment, his shadow loomed over her, and she felt a flicker of the woman she used to be, the woman who had married him for love, believing they would build a kingdom together. You look tired, he remarked, blowing a cloud of smoke toward her monitors. Try to put on some color before the dinner tonight. My mother is coming, and I don't need her complaining that my wife looks like a corpse. It reflects poorly on me. I've been awake for 20 hours securing your freedom, she said softly, her voice steady despite the roar of resentment in her chest. Giovanni chuckled, a cold, dry sound. He reached out and patted her cheek, not a caress, but a patronizing tap. And you've done a fine job, Elena. Just remember, anyone can learn to move numbers. Don't start thinking you're irreplaceable. He turned and walked out, leaving the scent of smoke and the chill of his indifference behind. Elena sat in the silence, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked down at the screen, at the millions of dollars she controlled with a single finger. Giovanni thought he was the king because he wore the crown, but he had forgotten who had forged it. He had forgotten that the person who knows how to hide the money is also the person who knows how to make it vanish. She took a slow, deep breath, her eyes hardening. She wasn't a piece of furniture. She wasn't a ghost. She was the architect of his survival, and as she began to open a new, hidden tab on her browser, she realized she was about to become the architect of his ruin. The heavy, Double oak doors of the De Luca estate creaked open with an air of ominous authority, signaling the arrival of the family's true matriarch. Donna Beatrice didn't enter a room, she occupied it, her presence a suffocating cloud of vintage perfume and sharp, judgmental silence. She was draped in a deep emerald suit that looked more like armor than silk, and as her eyes swept across the foyer, they landed on Elena with the precision of a predator marking its prey. "The house smells of burnt garlic and desperation," Beatrice remarked, not even waiting to be greeted. She handed her fur coat to a trembling maid without looking at her, her gaze remaining fixed on Elena's face. "I suppose that is what happens when a woman spends her time playing with computers instead of tending to her household duties." Elena offered a practiced, neutral smile, the kind she had worn for years to survive these encounters. "Good evening, Beatrice. Giovanni is in the library. We were just preparing to head to the restaurant." "Giovanni is a man burdened by the world," Beatrice snapped, stepping closer until she was inches from Elena's personal space. "He needs a sanctuary, not a bookkeeper in a cocktail dress." She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a small, ornate thermos and a porcelain cup. "Drink this." "All of it." Elena looked down at the steaming liquid. The smell was bitter, herbaceous, and cloyingly sweet. "What is it?" "Fertility tea," Beatrice said, her voice dropping to a low, venomous hiss. "A blend from the old country. Since you have failed to provide my son with an heir after 3 years of marriage, I have to resort to more traditional methods. Drink." Behind Beatrice, the servants lowered their heads, embarrassed to witness the humiliation. Elena felt the heat of shame rising in her throat. "Beatrice, we've discussed this," the doctors said. "I don't care what those expensive thieves in lab coats said," the older woman interrupted, forcing the cup into Elena's hand. "In this family, a woman who cannot produce a son is a hollow vessel. She is a curse. If you don't provide an heir by the end of this year, I will see to it that Giovanni finds someone who can. I will not have the De Luca name die out because my son chose a wife who is dry inside." The cruelty of the words was a physical weight. Elena looked toward the library door, hoping, praying that Giovanni would emerge and defend her. Instead, the door remained shut. He was only 30 feet away, and she knew he could hear his mother's sharp, piercing voice. He chose the silence. He chose to let his wife be gutted in the hallway of her own home. "Drink," Beatrice commanded again, her eyes narrowing. Elena lifted the cup to her lips. The tea was foul, stinging her tongue with a metallic aftertaste that made her stomach churn. She forced it down, every swallow a reminder of her status in this house. She wasn't a person, she was a biological clock that was failing to tick. Beatrice snatched the empty cup back, a smirk of triumph playing on her thin, red lips. "Good. Perhaps there is a spark of life in you yet. But don't get comfortable, Elena. A man like Giovanni only waits so long for a return on his investment. If the tea doesn't work, I've already started looking at the daughters of the Valenti family. They are young, fertile, and they know their place." Beatrice turned on her heel and glided toward the library, leaving Elena standing alone in the cold foyer. The bitter tea burned in her chest, but it was nothing compared to the cold, hard knot of resolve forming in her mind. She realized then that they weren't just waiting for a child, they were waiting for her to break. As she wiped a stray drop of the bitter liquid from her lip, Elena realized something they didn't. They thought they were preparing her to be a mother. They didn't realize they were finally giving her a reason to be an assassin. The restaurant was a cathedral of excess, all gold leaf, velvet shadows, and the hushed whispers of men who decided the city's fate over plates of blood-rare steak. Elena sat at the center of the long table, the silk of her pink dress feeling like a target against her skin. To her left, Giovanni was deep in a hushed, laughing conversation with a rival boss, a man named Cashin whose reputation for brutality was only matched by his lack of restraint. To her right, Beatrice sat like a gargoyle in green, her eyes tracking every move Elena made with a look of pure, unadulterated loathing. The air grew thick as the wine flowed. Cashin, already 3 bottles deep, leaned across the table, his eyes lingering on Elena with a greasy, predatory hunger. The table went quiet as he spoke. "You know, Giovanni, I hear the whispers. People are saying the De Luca line is coming to a dead end. Such a shame to waste such a pretty little thing on a house with no children." Elena's fork went still. She looked at Giovanni, waiting for the flash of anger, the protective growl, the hand on his holster that would signal he still considered her his. But Giovanni didn't even look up from his glass. He just swirled the dark red liquid, a smirk playing on his lips. "It's a disappointment, I'll give you that," Giovanni replied, his voice casual, as if he were discussing a faulty car. "But what can you do? Some things just aren't built for the long haul." Cashin let out a bark of laughter that made the ice in Elena's glass rattle. "Well, if you can't get the job done, Giovanni, maybe you should let a real man take a turn. I'd be happy to test her fertility myself. I've never had a problem producing sons." The insult was so vile, so public, that the air seemed to leave the room. The guards at the door shifted uncomfortably. Elena felt the blood drain from her face, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She stared at her husband, her eyes pleading for him to say something, anything, to reclaim her dignity. Giovanni finally looked at her, but there was no fire in his eyes. Only a cold, mocking amusement. He leaned back in his chair and gestured toward Elena with a lazy wave of his hand. "Be my guest, Cashin," he said, his voice carrying clearly to every ear in the room. "She's not doing much else for me these days. If you can find a use for her, you're a better man than I am." The table erupted in laughter. It was a roar of masculine cruelty that felt like a physical assault. Elena felt herself shrinking, the walls of the restaurant closing in on her. But the final blow was yet to come. Beatrice stood up, her face twisted in a mask of manic delight. "She needs to be taught what happens to women who fail their masters," the older woman cackled. She reached out, her hands steady and deliberate, and grabbed Cashin's full glass of vintage Barolo. With a slow, sweeping motion, Beatrice turned the glass over directly above Elena's head. The wine was cold. It felt like a shock of ice as it hit her scalp, soaking into her hair and cascading down her face in dark, crimson streaks. It ruined the pink silk, staining her shoulders and dripping onto her plate, turning her dinner into a soggy, red mess. Elena sat frozen, the liquid stinging her eyes, a single drop hanging from her chin before falling into the white tablecloth. The room was deafening. The men were howling, pounding the table, while Giovanni took a slow, deliberate sip from his own glass, refusing to even look at the red-stained woman sitting beside him. In that moment, the last flickering ember of love Elena had held for him didn't just die, it turned to ash. As the wine dripped into her eyes, blurring her vision, she realized she was no longer a wife. She was a ghost. And ghosts don't feel pain. They only haunt. The laughter was a dull roar in Elena's ears, a wall of sound that made the room feel miles away. She sat perfectly still, the red wine seeping into the pores of her skin, smelling of fermented grapes and public execution. She looked at her hands, resting white-knuckled on the edge of the table. They were stained red, looking as though she had just committed the very murder she was currently contemplating. Slowly, deliberately, Elena pushed her chair back. The screech of the wood against the marble floor was a sharp, ugly sound that cut through the laughter like a blade. The table fell silent, not out of respect, but out of curiosity to see what the broken woman would do next. "I'm leaving," Elena said. Her voice was thin, but it didn't tremble. She stood up, her legs feeling like lead. As she turned to navigate the narrow space between the table and the wall, Beatrice leaned forward. With the practiced grace of a viper, the older woman extended a polished heel into Elena's path. Elena didn't see it until it was too late. Her foot caught, and she went down hard. Her palms slapped against the cold floor, the impact jarring her shoulders and sending a fresh wave of wine dripping from her hair onto the tiles. The silence lasted for a heartbeat before a fresh wave of snickering broke out. Cashin whistled low, while Beatrice looked down at her with an expression of feigned pity. Oh dear. It seems she can't even walk without stumbling. Truly useless. Elena didn't look at Beatrice. She turned her head, looking up from the floor at Giovanni. He was still sitting, his arm draped casually over the back of his chair. He didn't reach out. He didn't even flinch. He looked down at her with the same bored irritation he might show a spilled drink. Giovanni, she whispered, a final, involuntary test of his humanity. He signaled to a nearby waiter, pointing a lazy finger at the floor near Elena's knees. Clean up the mess on the floor, he commanded. It's ruining the atmosphere of the dinner. He wasn't talking about the wine. He was talking about her. The humiliation was so complete it crossed the border into a strange, crystalline clarity. The weight that had been crushing Elena's chest for 3 years suddenly vanished. The fear of his temper, the anxiety of his mother's judgment, the desperate need to be seen, it all evaporated. In its place was a vacuum, cold and quiet and infinitely powerful. Elena placed her hands flat on the floor and pushed herself up. She didn't wipe the wine from her face. She didn't brush the dust from her ruined dress. She stood tall, her spine a column of steel, and looked directly into Giovanni's eyes. For the first time in their marriage, he was the one who looked away first, unnerved by the absolute deadness in her gaze. You're right, Giovanni, she said, her voice now loud and clear enough to carry to the back of the room. The mess does need to be cleaned up. And I'm going to start with the trash. She turned and walked away. She didn't run. She didn't cover her face. She walked through the center of the restaurant with the wine still dripping from her chin, her head held high. Behind her, she heard Beatrice start to shriek an insult, but the words couldn't reach her anymore. She pushed through the heavy velvet curtains and out into the cool night air. The city lights blurred through the wine and tears in her eyes, but she didn't stop. She reached the sidewalk, the cold wind hitting her wet skin, and for the first time in 3 years, she took a breath that didn't feel like it was borrowed. She was untethered. She was ruined. And as she looked down the dark street, she realized that a woman with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous thing the De Luca family had ever created. The cold night air hit the wine-soaked silk of Elena's dress, sending a violent shiver through her frame, but she kept walking. She reached the edge of the sidewalk, the neon lights of the city bleeding into the dark asphalt like neon bruises. She was alone, humiliated, and marked by the crimson stain of her husband's betrayal, or so she thought. A sleek, matte black sedan pulled up to the curb with the silent grace of a ghost. The door opened, and a man stepped out. He wasn't one of Giovanni's men. He was taller, broader, and carried an aura of quiet power that made the air around him feel heavy. This was Marco, the head of the syndicate that had been at the De Luca's throat for a decade. He was the man the family feared, the cleaner of the underworld who moved in shadows Giovanni couldn't even see. He didn't speak at first. He walked toward her, his eyes scanning the red wine dripping from her hair and the ruined pink fabric of her dress. He didn't look at her with the pity she expected. He looked at her with a simmering, protective rage. Without a word, Marco stripped off his heavy cashmere overcoat. He stepped into her space, his warmth shielding her from the wind, and draped the coat over her shoulders. It was heavy, smelling of cedarwood and expensive tobacco, a scent of safety she hadn't known in years. A queen shouldn't be sitting in the mud with pigs, Elena, he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Elena looked up at him, her vision still blurred. You saw? I've been watching for a long time, Marco replied, his hand lingering for a fraction of a second on the lapel of the coat. He didn't offer her a tissue to wipe the wine away. Instead, he reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a thick, manila folder. He held it out to her like a weapon. I think it's time you stopped carrying the weight of his failures. Elena opened the folder with trembling fingers. Under the dim street lamp, the words on the medical documents jumped out at her. It was a specialist's report from a clinic in Switzerland, dated 2 years ago. The name at the top was Giovanni De Luca. The diagnosis was absolute, permanent infertility. The breath hitched in her throat. Every insult Beatrice had hurled, every fertility tea she had been forced to choke down, every time Giovanni had called her a hollow vessel, it had all been a lie. A calculated, systemic cover-up to protect his fragile ego at the cost of her soul. He knew, she whispered, the paper crinkling in her grip. He knew it was him the whole time. He let them stone you to hide his own shame, Marco said, stepping closer, his presence a solid wall against the world. But Giovanni made a mistake. He forgot that the woman he was stepped on is the same woman who holds the keys to his vault. You know where the bodies are buried, Elena. You know where the money is hidden. He reached out, his thumb finally grazing her cheek, catching a stray drop of wine before it could fall. His touch was electric, a stark contrast to the cold indifference of the man she had just left. I'm not here to save you, Marco whispered, his eyes locking onto hers with a terrifying intensity. I'm here to help you burn it all down. The car is waiting. We have work to do. Elena looked back at the glowing windows of the restaurant, where the muffled sounds of laughter still echoed. She looked at the folder in her hand, then back at the man standing before her. The victim in the pink dress died on that sidewalk. In her place stood a woman who finally understood that her silence was the only thing keeping the DeLuca empire standing. Drive, she said, her voice dropping into a cold, lethal calm. I want to show you exactly how much money he thinks he has. The penthouse office Marco occupied was a sanctuary of glass and steel, overlooking a city that had no idea the tectonic plates of its underworld were about to shift. Elena didn't wait for an invitation. She sat at the center of the mahogany desk, Marco's heavy coat still draped over her shoulders like a suit of armor. She didn't bother cleaning the dried wine from her skin, the sticky crimson served as a fuel, a constant physical reminder of the debt she was about to collect. Marco watched her in silence as she opened a secure laptop. He didn't hover. He simply placed a glass of water and an encrypted drive next to her hand. The DeLuca family thinks they are invisible because they buy the light, he said softly. They forget that the shadows are where the real power lives. Giovanni thinks he's a god because he has a crown, Elena muttered, her fingers flying across the keys with a speed born of years of suppressed rage. He forgot that I'm the one who built his throne, and I know exactly which leg to saw off. For 3 years, Elena had been the ghost in the machine. Every bribe, every warehouse lease, and every offshore transfer had passed through her fingers. Giovanni had been too arrogant to realize that by giving her the boring task of managing the books, he had given her the blueprints to his execution. She began by triggering a silent, red flag, protocol she had hidden in the family's accounting software months ago. It was a Trojan horse, designed to look like a routine internal audit, but its true purpose was far more lethal. With a series of keystrokes, she funneled the digital breadcrumbs of 3 major racketeering operations into a neat, undeniable package. She didn't send it to the police, she sent it to the Federal Forensic Accounting Division, addressed to the lead investigator who had been chasing Giovanni for a decade. The feds will have the warehouse locations and the shipping manifests by dawn, she whispered, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in her cold eyes. He'll be fighting fires he can't see. But the legal ruin was only the beginning. Elena moved to the final phase, the money. The DeLuca fortune was spread across 12 dark accounts in Zurich and the Cayman Islands. To Giovanni, these were his lifeblood, the source of his power and his protection. Elena opened the transfer portal. One by one, she began moving the liquid assets, millions of dollars, into the new, untraceable account Marco had prepared. Every cent he's made from the blood of others, Elena said, her voice dropping into a rhythmic, haunting cadence. Every dollar he used to buy his mother's jewelry and his own silence. It's gone. Marco leaned against the desk, a shadow of a smile touching his lips. He'll wake up to a kingdom of paper and dust. He'll wake up to nothing, Elena corrected. She hit the final enter key. The progress bar flickered and turned green. Transfer complete. In a single hour, she had stripped the DeLuca family of their history, their future, and their safety. She closed the laptop and finally reached for the water, her hands steady. The wine on her face felt like a mask of war, and for the first time, she didn't feel the need to wash it off. "I'm going back tomorrow morning," she said, looking at Marco. "I want to see the moment he realizes his empire is a ghost, just like he thought I was." Marco nodded, his eyes filled with a new kind of respect. "The car will be ready at 6. A queen should always be present for the fall of a tyrant." The morning sun filtered through the sheer curtains of the DeLuca dining room, casting long, mocking stripes of gold across the silver tea service. Elena sat at the head of the table, perfectly composed. She had replaced the ruined pink silk with a tailored, ivory suit that screamed of quiet lethargy. Every hair was back in place, her skin scrubbed clean of the wine, but her eyes remained as cold as the marble beneath her feet. The heavy thud of footsteps echoed from the grand staircase. Giovanni entered, looking disheveled and irritable, his phone pressed to his ear. Behind him trailed Beatrice, her emerald suit from the night before replaced by an equally sharp charcoal dress. She looked at Elena and scoffed, clearly disappointed that her daughter-in-law hadn't crawled away into the night. "I don't know what to tell you, the connection is dead." Giovanni barked into the phone, slamming it down on the table. "The secure line is down, and my laptop won't even bypass the BIOS. Some technical glitch." He sat down heavily, not bothering to look at Elena. "Where's my coffee? And why is the TV on?" "I thought you'd want to see the morning news, Giovanni," Elena said, her voice smooth and melodic as she poured a cup of Earl Grey. "It's a very busy day for the city." Giovanni leaned forward to grab a piece of toast, his eyes flickering toward the wall-mounted screen. The headline crawled across the bottom in bright, urgent red: "Massive federal raid on DeLuca warehouses. 6 arrested in racketeering sting." Giovanni froze, the toast halfway to his mouth. "What is this?" he hissed, his face draining of color. He grabbed his phone again, dialing frantically. "Why didn't the Port Authority call me? Where are the guards?" "They're likely being handcuffed, dear," Beatrice said, her voice trembling with a rare note of fear. "Giovanni, call the bank. Move the reserve funds to the legal retainers immediately." Elena sipped her tea, the porcelain clinking softly against her teeth. "The banks won't answer, Giovanni. I checked them about an hour ago. It seems there's been a massive migration of capital." Giovanni's head snapped toward her, his eyes narrowing. "What are you talking about? What migration?" "The offshore accounts. Zurich, Panama, the Caymans." Elena listed them off with the boredom of someone reading a grocery list. "They're empty. To the last cent. Even the black accounts you kept hidden from the family board. I believe the current balance is 0. Or perhaps a few cents, if I left the change for the bank fees." The silence that followed was deafening. Giovanni stood up so quickly his chair toppled backward, crashing against the floor. He lunged for her, his hand raised, but he stopped when he saw her expression. There was no fear in her eyes. Only a vast, predatory vacuum. "You," he breathed, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "You did this. You stole from me?" "I didn't steal anything, Giovanni," she replied, setting her tea down with a steady hand. "I simply collected my back pay for 3 years of cleaning up your messes. Consider it a divorce settlement. Though, technically, since you have no money left to pay a lawyer, the paperwork will be very one-sided." Beatrice let out a strangled cry, clutching her pearls. "You ungrateful little viper. We gave you everything. We gave you a name." "You gave me a target," Elena corrected, standing up slowly. The TV behind her flickered to a new image, federal agents carrying crates of documents out of their main office. "And you gave me a reason. You thought I was a hollow vessel, Beatrice. It turns out, I was just a reservoir. And last night, the dam broke." Giovanni reached for his phone again, his hands shaking. "I'll kill you. I'll have every man in this city hunting you by noon. With what money, Giovanni? Elena asked, walking toward the door. You can't even afford the gas for your car. The guards outside? They haven't been paid since midnight. And Marco? He's already absorbed your territory. You aren't a boss anymore. You're just a man in an expensive suit with nowhere to go. She paused at the door, looking back one last time at the wreckage of the family that thought they could break her. Enjoy your breakfast. It's the last meal this house will ever serve. Giovanni didn't move. He stood amidst the ruins of his breakfast, his chest heaving as he stared at the television screen that was broadcasting the death of his legacy. The arrogance that usually defined his posture had collapsed, leaving him looking smaller, older, and frantic. I'll fix this, he muttered, more to himself than to Elena. I have connections. I have the bloodline. My sons will carry this name back to the top. Elena stopped in her tracks. She turned around slowly, a cold, pitying smile playing on her lips. Your sons, Giovanni? Beatrice stepped forward, her voice trembling but still sharp. Yes. He is a DeLuca. He will find a woman who isn't a failure, and he will build a new army. You are nothing but a footnote in our history. Elena reached into the pocket of her ivory blazer and pulled out the small, folded medical report Marco had given her in the car. She walked back toward the table, the click of her heels sounding like the ticking of a countdown. She didn't throw it. She placed it gently on Giovanni's plate, right on top of his cold eggs. I think it's time you stopped lying to your mother, Giovanni. And more importantly, time you stopped lying to yourself. Giovanni looked down at the paper. He didn't pick it up at first. He didn't need to. He recognized the letterhead of the clinic in Switzerland. His eyes darted across the page, freezing on the words total azoospermia and irreversible. What is that? Beatrice demanded, reaching for the paper. What does it say? Giovanni tried to grab it first, his face turning a sickly shade of gray, but Beatrice was faster. She snatched the document and read it, her eyes widening behind her designer glasses. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating the room. The fertility tea, the years of blaming Elena, the public humiliation at the restaurant, all of it crumbled under the weight of a single medical truth. You knew, Beatrice whispered, looking at her son with a mixture of horror and disgust. You let me believe, you let the whole city believe it was her fault. I was protecting the name. Giovanni roared, his voice cracking. I couldn't let them think I was weak. A boss who can't produce an heir is a boss with a target on his back. And yet, Elena intercepted, her voice cool and steady, by trying to hide your weakness, you created your greatest enemy. You called me a hollow vessel to mask your own shame. You let Cashin pour wine over my head while you laughed, all to prove you were a man. She stepped closer to him, her face inches from his. But look at you now, Giovanni. You have no money. You have no warehouses. You have no loyalty. And now, you have no legacy. You aren't a king. You aren't even a man. You're just a small, lonely person in a very big, empty house. Giovanni looked at her, and for the first time, Elena saw true, unadulterated fear in his eyes. He realized that the woman standing before him wasn't the wife he had ignored for years. She was the person who had completely dismantled his existence, and she had done it while he was busy laughing at her. You won't get away with this, he wheezed, his voice losing its strength. I already have, Elena said. She looked at Beatrice, who was still staring at the medical report as if it were a poisonous snake. Keep the paper, Beatrice. It's the only thing left of the DeLuca bloodline you were so proud of. Elena turned her back on them for the final time. As she walked out of the mansion, she didn't look back at the gold-leafed ceilings or the expensive art. She walked out into the sunlight where Marco was waiting by the black sedan. She took a deep breath of the fresh morning air, and for the first time in her life, the taste of the world wasn't bitter. 5 years had passed, but for Giovanni, time had effectively stopped the moment the heavy oak doors of the De Luca mansion clicked shut behind Elena. In the underworld, power is a shadow. It vanishes the moment the light of money and loyalty goes out. Without Elena's brilliant mind balancing the books and scrubbing the digital trails, the empire didn't just crumble, it evaporated. The city was gray today, a cold, relentless drizzle washing the grime of the sidewalk into the gutters of a neighborhood Giovanni once wouldn't have even driven through. He sat on a rusted folding chair in a cramped, one-bedroom apartment that smelled of damp laundry and the bitter residue of cheap cigarettes. The De Luca name, once whispered in terrified reverence, was now a punchline in the low-rent bars he now frequented. He spent his days dodging creditors and his nights staring at the peeling wallpaper, haunted by the crushing silence of a life stripped of its noise. Beatrice was gone, hidden away in a state-funded assisted living facility. Her mind had retreated into a fog where she still believed she was a queen, barking orders at overworked nurses who didn't even know her name. Giovanni was truly, utterly alone. He reached for a discarded magazine on the coffee table, his fingers stained with the grime of a life he no longer led. He didn't usually look at the glossies, they were reminders of a world that had evicted him. But a face on the cover caught the dim light of the single buzzing bulb above him. His heart didn't just skip, it felt like it withered in his chest. It was Elena. She wasn't wearing the muted, submissive pink of a victim anymore. She was draped in a gown of midnight blue velvet that looked like the evening sky, her eyes sparking with a fire that was no longer cold or distant. She was standing at a podium, identified as the CEO of a global venture capital firm. She hadn't just survived the fall of the De Luca family, she had used the ruins to build a skyscraper. But it wasn't the wealth that gutted him. It was the photo on the second page. Elena was stepping into a car, and a man was waiting for her, Marco. He didn't treat her like a piece of furniture or a utility. He held the door with a look of profound, visible respect. And in the seat behind them sat a toddler with dark, curly hair and eyes that were full of life and mischief. Giovanni's hand trembled so violently the page tore. The medical report had labeled him as the one who was broken, but seeing her with a child, a legacy he had spent years convincing her she was too dry to provide, was the final, jagged glass in his soul. She hadn't been the problem. He had been the poison. He had spent years gaslighting a woman who was a literal goddess of strategy and grace, all to protect an ego that was now worth less than the scrap paper in his hands. He looked around his miserable room, at the empty bottle of bottom-shelf whiskey and the flickering light. He had thrown away a diamond to keep a pile of rocks labeled pride. He realized then that his true hell wasn't the poverty or the disgrace. His hell was the clarity of his own regret. He had to live every remaining second of his life knowing that she was happy, she was loved, and she had built a kingdom that he would never be allowed to enter. He closed his eyes, but all he could see was that single drop of red wine dripping from her hair at the dinner table. He had thought that was his moment of ultimate control. He realized now, as he sat in the cold dark, that it was the exact moment he had become irrelevant. The moral lesson from this story is that the world is a master of deception. It will try to tell you that your value is tied to what you can provide, how much you can cook, how quietly you can serve, or how many heirs you can carry for a name that doesn't respect you. It will try to convince you that your silence is a sign of your obedience and that your worth is a number decided by those who hold the checkbook. But a woman is not a vessel to be filled with someone else's expectations. She is an empire in her own right, waiting for the moment she decides to stop building someone else's throne and starts carving out her own. To the men who think that silence is a sign of weakness, be careful. The quietest person in the room is often the one documenting your every mistake, mapping your every vulnerability, and preparing for the day they no longer need you. While you are busy enjoying the sound of your own voice, she is learning the melody of your ruin. Strength isn't found in the roar of a crowd or the weight of a fist, it is found in the calm hand that signs the papers, the steady mind that moves the money, and the heart that remains stone cold while the world tries to set it on fire. To the women who feel small tonight, who feel the weight of a wine-stained humiliation or the sting of a cold shoulder, remember the diamond. A diamond is nothing more than a piece of coal that stayed under extreme pressure and refused to break. The very fire they use to try and consume you is the fire that will eventually forge your crown. Your worth is not defined by those who fail to see it. It is not defined by a mother-in-law's cruelty or a husband's indifference. It is defined by the strength you find to stand up from the floor, wipe the wine from your face, and walk away into a life you built with your own 2 hands. Giovanni lived in a mansion, but he was a prisoner of his own ego. Elena walked out with nothing but a ruined dress and a folder of secrets, but she was the only one who was truly free. In the end, the De Luca name became a ghost, while the woman they tried to erase became a legend. Never mistake a woman's patience for her permission. Because when the invisible wife finally decides to be seen, she won't just take her place at the table, she will take the whole room. Don't wait for them to give you a seat. Build your own palace. The De Luca family learned the hard way: never underestimate the person holding the books. For more stories of secrets, scandals, and the ultimate payback, subscribe and turn on notifications. The next story is already unfolding.